In October of 1813, the greatest army Europe had ever witnessed marched toward its destiny. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered kingdoms and reshaped empires, prepared for one final gamble, a battle that would decide the fate of the continent. But behind the shining uniforms and roaring cannons lay a darker truth. The grand army that once swept across Europe with unstoppable force was now a hollow shadow of its former glory, weakened, exhausted, and unknowingly marching into a trap. Across the fields of Leipzig, a new kind of danger waited. A force Napoleon could not outmaneuver, an enemy he could not see, a weapon more powerful than gunpowder itself. And as the armies closed in, the Emperor of France had no idea that this invisible weapon was already destroying his army from within. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power is one of the most remarkable transformations in world history. A journey from a quiet, determined boy on the isolated island of Corsica to the ruler of an empire that stretched across most of Europe. Born in 1769, just months after France seized Corsica, he grew up amid political tension, local rebellions, and the lingering resentment of foreign rule. These early experiences shaped his worldview, teaching him both the bitterness of oppression and the importance of strength. Even as a child, Napoleon was unusually intense. While other boys played, he read history, mathematics, and military theory. His personal library included works on ancient warfare, biographies of Alexander the Great, and treatises on strategy. He admired great conquerors but believed he could surpass them not through birth, but through intellect and determination. At age 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France for military education. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent and often kept to himself. Classmates mocked him for his origins, and teachers noted his brooding personality. But behind the shyness lay an extraordinary mind. Napoleon excelled in mathematics, geography, and history, subjects that would later define his military genius. While other cadets memorized drills, Napoleon studied maps for hours, mastering the movement of armies and the logic of terrain. He graduated as a young artillery officer, already convinced that artillery, the science of mathematics applied to war, would become the key to modern battles. Then came 1789. The French Revolution erupted, plunging the country into chaos. The monarchy collapsed, the aristocracy fled, and the army lost thousands of senior officers. While France descended into fear and violence, opportunity rose for young, talented officers with revolutionary loyalty. It was the perfect environment for Napoleon to rise. His first real opportunity arrived in 1793. During the siege of Toulon, royalist rebels, backed by the British Navy, had seized the port, and the revolutionary government was desperate to retake it. Napoleon, then a little-known captain, presented a bold plan: use concentrated artillery fire to break the British defenses, isolate their ships, and force the city's surrender. His strategy worked flawlessly. British forces withdrew, and Toulon returned to French control. The victory made Napoleon a hero. At just 24 years old, he was promoted to brigadier general. France had found a brilliant young commander, one who understood both tactics and the psychology of war. But Napoleon was far from finished. In 1796, at the age of 26, he received command of the Army of Italy, a force that was starving, poorly supplied, and on the verge of collapse. Many believed the appointment was a mistake. Napoleon proved them wrong almost immediately. He revived the army with speeches that ignited hope and a sense of destiny. He restructured logistics, maintained discipline, and moved with a speed that astonished his opponents. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon launched a series of campaigns that became legendary. He defeated Austrian forces again and again, using rapid marches, flanking maneuvers, and unexpected attacks to overwhelm armies much larger than his own. His victory stunned Europe and elevated him to mythic status among the French people. Soldiers adored him for sharing their hardships. Enemies feared him for his unpredictability and precision. Diplomats began calling him the Little Corporal, a nickname born not of size, but of admiration. By the late 1790s, France was collapsing politically. The revolutionary government, known as the Directory, was corrupt and unstable. Economic crisis, internal revolts, and military challenges threatened the nation's survival. Napoleon saw the weakness and recognized his moment. In November 1799, he executed a brilliant political maneuver known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. Without firing a single shot, he dismantled the failing government and established a new one with himself as first consul. In effect, he became the leader of France. The people accepted him because he brought order, stability, and hope after years of chaos. But Napoleon's ambition stretched far beyond stabilizing France. He wanted greatness. He wanted empire. In 1804, in a grand ceremony in Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not a ruler granted power by nobles or divine right. This was a self-made emperor, empowered by his own achievements. At this moment, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. He reorganized the government, rewrote the legal system with the Napoleonic Code, rebuilt schools, modernized the economy, and centralized administrative control. His reforms reshaped France for generations. But his most powerful creation was the Grand Army. It was not just a force, it was a phenomenon. Highly trained, fiercely loyal, and battle-tested, the Grand Army became Napoleon's instrument of domination. Between 1805 and 1809, Napoleon unleashed the Grand Army across Europe. With astonishing success, at Austerlitz, he crushed the combined armies of Russia and Austria in what is considered one of the greatest military victories in history. At Jena and Arstedt, he shattered Prussia in a single day. At Friedland, he humbled Russia again. His empire expanded rapidly. Kings became his subjects, and entire nations fell under French influence. By 1810, Napoleon controlled more land than any ruler since the days of Rome. Borders were redrawn, dynasties were replaced, and Europe was reshaped in the image of a single man. But dominance brought new challenges. Napoleon's empire had grown too large, too fast. Logistical strains increased, resistance movements emerged, and rival nations learned to adapt to his tactics. The seeds of his destruction had already taken root, and far to the east, a disastrous decision was about to change everything. The invasion of Russia, intended to force obedience, would instead unravel the Grand Army and lead Napoleon toward the fateful Battle of Leipzig, where the secret weapon that would crush his empire was waiting. As Napoleon's empire reached its peak, Europe trembled beneath his influence, but beneath the surface, resistance was growing. The monarchies he had humiliated, the nations he had reshaped, and the armies he had shattered now watched him with a mixture of fear and determination. And slowly, quietly, they began to unite. Prussia, once a proud military power, had been humiliated at Jena. Austria had been defeated multiple times and stripped of territory. Russia, although temporarily subdued, had grown increasingly resentful of Napoleon's demands. Even Sweden, which had remained neutral for years, turned against the French Empire. By 1812, these nations, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and several German states began forming what would become known as the Sixth Coalition, a massive alliance unlike anything Europe had seen in centuries. Their single goal, to bring an end to Napoleon's domination of the continent. But the spark that ignited their unity came from Napoleon himself. Through his most disastrous decision, the invasion of Russia in 1812, Napoleon believed that forcing Russia back into obedience would secure his empire forever. To accomplish this, he assembled the largest army the world had ever witnessed, over 600,000 soldiers from across the French Empire, French, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Germans, and even reluctant allies. It was not just an army, it was a continent marching east. Yet Napoleon made a fatal miscalculation. He expected a swift, decisive battle. Instead, the Russians retreated deep into their vast territory. burning their own farms and cities to deny the invaders food and shelter. Napoleon pressed forward, unaware that he was walking into a wasteland carefully crafted to destroy him. As the Grand Army advanced, exhaustion, disease, hunger, and heat began to eat away at its strength. But the true catastrophe struck after Napoleon captured Moscow. The city, largely abandoned and burning, provided no victory, no peace treaty, no resources, no end to the war. Winter arrived early, harsher than anything Napoleon's men had ever faced. Freezing winds, blizzards, and temperatures dropping below 30°C turned the retreat from Moscow into one of history's greatest military disasters. Horses collapsed in the snow, cannons were abandoned, soldiers froze where they stood. Russian Cossacks attacked relentlessly along the edges, striking like ghosts out of the snow. By the time the survivors stumbled back into friendly territory, the once mighty Grand Army of 600,000 had been reduced to barely 80,000 men. It was not just a defeat, it was annihilation. News of Napoleon's disaster spread like wildfire through Europe. Cities that had once feared him now sensed weakness. Governments he had once intimidated began to reconsider their loyalty. In Prussia, officers whispered that France was no longer invincible. In Austria, leaders debated whether to keep supporting Napoleon or finally break free. In London, the British government saw an opportunity to bring the French Empire to its knees. Even common people, farmers, merchants, students spoke of hope for the first time in years. Napoleon's aura of invincibility, built through a decade of victories, was shattered in a matter of months. Sensing that the balance of power had shifted, Russia made the first move. Tsar Alexander I urged the monarchs of Europe to unite, arguing that Napoleon's empire was built on fear and fear could be overcome. Prussia and Sweden joined quickly. Austria hesitated at first, hoping to negotiate with France, but soon realized that Napoleon's position was hopelessly weakened. By 1813, the Sixth Coalition had formed fully. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, Spain, and countless German principalities all preparing for one final war against the French Emperor. It was a coalition unlike any before, diverse, determined, and fueled by a shared desire for liberation. Meanwhile, Napoleon faced a grim reality. His Grand Army was gone. The elite veterans who had carried him to victory were dead, scattered across the frozen fields of Russia. To rebuild, he had no choice but to conscript young, inexperienced recruits, many barely 18 years old. These Marie Louises, as they were mockingly called, were brave but untrained. They lacked the discipline, the battle instinct, and the unity that Napoleon's veterans had possessed. Napoleon rushed to assemble new armies, but time was against him. The coalition advanced rapidly, pushing French forces out of Germany and rallying local populations along the way. Entire regions that had once served Napoleon now revolted against him, inspired by the promise of liberation. Still, Napoleon refused to surrender. His strategic brilliance had not faded, and even with inexperienced troops, he managed to win several battles in the spring campaign of 1813. But victory only delayed the inevitable. The coalition armies grew larger each month. Supplies flowed in from Britain, Russian, and Prussian. Morale soared. Austrian neutrality crumbled, and their full military strength entered the war. Europe was finally united not by fear of Napoleon, but by determination to end him. By mid-1813, the stage was set for an enormous confrontation. The coalition gathered massive forces near the German city of Leipzig. Napoleon moved to meet them, determined to crush the alliance before it grew even stronger. But what he did not know was that Europe had developed a new way of waging war, an unprecedented level of coordination, communication, and mass firepower. This strategy would soon become the secret weapon that shattered his Grand Army once and for all. After the catastrophic retreat from Russia, Europe entered a new and turbulent phase. The continent was no longer divided, fearful, or hesitant. Instead, it was charged with a sense of possibility. an unspoken belief that the seemingly invincible Napoleon could finally be defeated across capitals from London to Vienna, from Berlin to St. Petersburg. The geopolitical atmosphere shifted dramatically. Former enemies began to see each other as allies, bound together by a single purpose: the liberation of Europe from French domination. This energy, this shared cause, became the fuel that pushed the coalition toward one of the largest military confrontations in history. But Napoleon was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. Even after losing the Grand Army, he refused to surrender his empire. The moment he returned to Paris in late 1812, he began working feverishly to restore French strength. He reorganized command structures, rallied government officials, and demanded fresh drafts of young men to refill the ranks of his shattered forces. Within months, a new army, young, inexperienced, but enormous, began to form. Napoleon understood that if he wanted to maintain control over Europe, he had to reclaim Germany, the heart of the continent. Losing Germany meant losing influence, losing allies, and losing the strategic advantage that had made France the dominant power of the era. By early 1813, Napoleon rushed eastward with astonishing speed, determined to reassert French dominance before the coalition could fully mobilize. His goal was clear: split Russian and Prussian armies apart before they had the chance to unite. In this early phase, Napoleon scored several tactical victories, including the battles of Leipzig and Bautzen, proving that even weakened, he remained a formidable force on the battlefield. But something had changed. Napoleon was no longer fighting disorganized coalitions or inexperienced generals. This time, Europe had learned from a decade of suffering, adapting to his methods and studying his weaknesses. At the heart of the coalition's new strategy were two men: Tsar Alexander I of Russia and General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher of Prussia. They understood that confronting Napoleon individually would lead to disaster. Each nation that had faced him alone had been crushed in turn. So they devised a new form of warfare, what historians now call convergence warfare. This strategy meant that individual coalition armies would avoid direct battles with Napoleon unless they had overwhelming superiority. Instead of fighting separately, they would move like parts of a giant mechanism spreading out across Germany, threatening multiple fronts and converging only when Napoleon exposed a weakness. Every retreat, every delay, every maneuver had a purpose: to force Napoleon into exhaustion, stretching his supply lines and overwhelming him with numbers. And numbers were exactly what the coalition had. As months passed, more nations joined the cause. Austria eventually broke its fragile neutrality, bringing one of the most powerful armies in Europe into the war: Sweden. Under the leadership of Crown Prince Charles John, ironically a former French marshal, committed tens of thousands of troops. Britain supplied vast amounts of money, weapons, and logistical support. By late 1813, the combined coalition forces had mobilized over 350,000 troops, with hundreds of thousands more in reserve. Napoleon, despite his setbacks, was still capable of astonishing mobilization. France and its satellite states raised massive levies of young men, attempting to refill the ranks of the once legendary Grand Army. Though lacking experience, these new recruits showed courage, marching east with speed and determination. By the autumn of 1813, Napoleon had assembled approximately 280,000 troops for his German campaign. Across both sides, Europe now had more than 600,000 soldiers preparing for an inevitable showdown. It was a scale of war unseen in the continent since the days of ancient empires. With so many armies moving across Central Europe, one question loomed over every commander: where would the final confrontation occur? The answer became increasingly clear: Leipzig. Situated at the crossroads of major routes linking Austria, Prussia, and Russia, Leipzig held immense strategic value. Whoever controlled Leipzig could control movement across central Germany. Its rivers, bridges, and marshy terrain made it both defensible and dangerous for Napoleon. Holding Leipzig meant retaining Germany and keeping the coalition armies divided. For the coalition, taking Leipzig meant shattering Napoleon's last foothold and severing his control over the continent. The geography of Leipzig played a crucial role in shaping what was to come. The region was surrounded by several rivers, the Pleiss, the Elster, and the Park, creating natural barriers that complicated troop movements. Marshlands and soft, waterlogged fields made cavalry charges risky and slowed down artillery. Narrow bridges and cramped villages turned retreats into bottlenecks, and advances into brutal close-quarters combat. The very land around Leipzig seemed designed for chaos. Napoleon understood this. He knew that if he positioned his forces correctly, he could force the coalition to attack through difficult terrain, giving him the advantage of interior lines, something he had used brilliantly throughout his career. But the coalition commanders saw the terrain differently. For them, Leipzig was a trap they intended to spring. Using convergence warfare, they planned to surround Napoleon on all sides: Russians from the east, Prussians from the north, Austrians from the south, Swedes from the northwest. They intended to crush the French army like a closing fist. Unlike previous wars, they would not allow Napoleon to split them or defeat them piecemeal. Leipzig was to be the site where the united strength of Europe would collide with the remnants of Napoleon's empire. As October 1813 approached, the air in Europe grew heavy with anticipation. Armies maneuvered through fog-shrouded fields, campfires glowed across the hills, and the distant rumble of artillery wagons echoed along the roads. Everyone knew that the coming battle would be enormous, perhaps the largest Europe had ever seen. There was no avoiding it. Napoleon needed to hold Leipzig to preserve his empire. The coalition needed to take Leipzig to end it. The stage was set. The armies were in position. The rivers, bridges, and marshlands around Leipzig waited silently for the clash. And as the sun rose over the German plains, Europe stood on the edge of a confrontation that would decide the fate of an entire continent. As the armies of Europe closed in around Leipzig, an uncomfortable truth was beginning to emerge. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had dominated the continent for more than a decade, no longer commanded the unstoppable machine he once led. His strategic brilliance still burned, sharp and focused, but the tools that had made him invincible were slipping from his grasp. Beneath the surface of his confident maneuvers lay a web of weaknesses, growing cracks in the French war machine that no amount of genius could completely conceal. And it was these very weaknesses that would prepare the stage for the secret weapon the coalition powers were quietly assembling against him. The first and most crippling flaw lay in Napoleon's supply lines. The disastrous Russian campaign had stretched French logistics to their limits, draining resources, horses, and manpower that could not be easily replaced. France itself was exhausted after years of war. Every corner of the empire had already given its grain, its iron, its sons. Now, as Napoleon rushed east to reclaim Germany, his army depended on fragile, overstretched supply routes running hundreds of miles across territories that were no longer loyal. Food, uniforms, medical supplies, and above all ammunition were arriving late, incomplete, or sometimes not at all. Soldiers marched hungry, boots worn thin, coats torn from years of campaigning. The days of the Grand Army moving like a perfect machine were gone. Every march now came at a cost. Ammunition shortages grew increasingly severe. Napoleon's power on the battlefield had always rested on speed, coordination, and overwhelming artillery fire. But without proper supplies, even the greatest guns become silent. Entire batteries found themselves rationing powder and shot. Some units were forced to recover cannonballs from previous battles just to have enough ammunition for the next one. Artillerymen complained quietly, officers improvised desperately, and couriers scrambled across the countryside trying to locate missing convoys. Napoleon knew the truth all too well. An army can march with hunger in its belly, but it cannot fight with empty caissons. The coalition, watching from a distance, sensed blood in the water. Then there was the cavalry, once the pride of Napoleon's forces. The Russian winter had killed tens of thousands of horses, freezing them where they stood. The French Empire struggled to replace them. Without cavalry, Napoleon's army lost its eyes and ears. Scouts could no longer sweep ahead and vast arcs to locate the enemy. Flanking maneuvers became risky. Pursuits, once French specialties, were far less effective. Even Napoleon's generals felt blinded, forced to act on incomplete information. The coalition, by contrast, had rebuilt its cavalry forces and now enjoyed a clear advantage in reconnaissance. In a war where positioning was everything, Napoleon was effectively fighting half-blind. Disease-struck necks, with stretched supply lines, poor sanitation, and young recruits lacking heart and discipline. Sickness spread rapidly through French camps. Fever, dysentery, and infection tore through the ranks, weakening thousands before the battle even began. Many soldiers were too sick to march. Others struggled to keep formation. Medical resources were woefully insufficient. What had once been an organized system of field hospitals had become overwhelmed and chaotic. Napoleon did his best to maintain morale, but he could not ignore the strings of wagons filled with the sick and dying trailing behind his army. Every mile Napoleon advanced, his strength diminished not because of enemy fire, but because of an invisible enemy eating away at his forces from within. Communication had always been one of Napoleon's greatest tools. His ability to move messages rapidly, coordinate divisions across wide distances, and reorganize battle plans within minutes had earned him countless victories. But now, communication networks were breaking down, couriers were intercepted, delayed, or lost. German regions once loyal to France now harbored anti-French partisans who disrupted communications. Roads were muddy, blocked, or controlled by hostile militias. Napoleon's orders sometimes took hours, occasionally days, to reach their intended destinations. While he planned swift, decisive strikes, the execution lagged behind. An army that once moved like a single living organism was slowly becoming fragmented. The coalition commanders recognized these weaknesses, and for the first time, they decided to weaponize them. Europe was no longer reacting to Napoleon, now it was outranking him. Coalition leaders adopted a new approach: intelligence warfare. Russian, Prussian, and Austrian scouts worked together, sharing information in real time, tracking Napoleon's movements, estimating his troop numbers, and predicting his supply shortages. Local populations secretly guided coalition scouts through forests and villages, enabling them to map French positions with remarkable accuracy. Napoleon, once the master of battlefield awareness, now found himself repeatedly surprised and unfamiliar position for the great emperor. But the coalition's most powerful innovation was something far more subtle and far more devastating. They developed a coordinated command system, an early form of what we could call modern joint operations, using couriers, prearranged signals, and chain-of-command networks. The coalition armies learned to move as one vast entity spread across Germany. They attacked from multiple directions, retreated only when advantageous, and converged at key positions the moment Napoleon showed vulnerability. This coordination allowed them to stretch French forces thin, forcing Napoleon to constantly relocate troops, burning precious time and resources. Every time Napoleon won a small battle, the coalition simply pulled back, regrouped, and returned stronger. It was a war of exhaustion, not speed. A war Napoleon was not designed to win. And so, as October 1813 approached, the greatest French general in history found himself at the center of a tightening circle. His army lacked supplies, horses, ammunition, and reliable communication. Disease weakened his ranks. His recruits, brave but inexperienced, faced battle-hardened coalition veterans. And worst of all, Napoleon was facing an enemy he could not easily overcome: a unified Europe, armed with intelligence, communication, and coordination more advanced than anything seen before. This invisible system, this unprecedented cooperation, was becoming the true secret weapon of the coalition, quietly positioning itself to deliver a devastating blow. Napoleon did not know it yet, but the tools of modern warfare, information, coordination, and unified command were about to collide with his army on the fields of Leipzig, and no amount of genius could stop what was coming. As the Battle of Leipzig began to unfold, Napoleon believed he was preparing for a conventional fight: mass infantry, disciplined cavalry, and the thunder of artillery shaping the field, as they always had. But what he faced here was something entirely new, something Europe had never seen before, a weapon far more devastating than any single cannon, rifle, or regiment. It was not forged from steel or gunpowder. It did not shine in the sun like a saber, nor roar like a cavalry charge. No, this weapon was forged from intelligence, coordination, unity, and precision. For the first time in history, for major powers Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden were not only fighting together, they were fighting as one machine. The coalition's leaders had studied Napoleon for years. They knew his strength, speed, surprise, aggressive movement, and they also understood his weaknesses: overextension, reliance on interior lines, and his need for rapid decision-making. So, they crafted something revolutionary: a synchronized warfare system that combined massed artillery, fast communication networks, and coordinated multi-direction attacks. This was not just a coalition. It was a unified weapons system, and Leipzig was the proving ground. The core of this system was the coalition's unified artillery strategy, the largest concentration of artillery Europe had ever seen. More than 2,200 cannons, Austrian heavy guns, Russian long barrels, Prussian horse artillery, and Swedish siege guns were positioned in layered formations across the battlefield. This massive battery was not static, it was alive, moving like a living organism. While Napoleon's cannons were scattered, depleted, and often stuck behind marshy terrain, the coalition's artillery moved with astonishing discipline. They rotated batteries in and out of firing positions, ensuring constant pressure. When one battery grew hot or low on ammunition, another rolled forward to replace it, keeping the stream of fire unbroken. It was continuous, rotating artillery, something the world had never seen executed on such a scale. But artillery alone was not enough. The secret behind its effectiveness lay in the interior communication network the coalition had built, using the fastest horse couriers, pre-planned dispatch points, signal flags, and telegraph-like relay systems. The coalition generals communicated across the battlefield with unprecedented speed. Orders that once took hours now took minutes. Tsar Alexander, General Blücher, Austrian Commander Schwarzenberg, and Swedish Crown Prince Charles John coordinated their moves as if reading from the same script. While Napoleon struggled to send messages through broken lines, intercepted couriers, or muddy, congested roads, the coalition was sharing battlefield intelligence in near real time. This communication network allowed the coalition armies to synchronize their attacks with mathematical precision. Russians advanced from the east, Prussians pushed from the north, Austrians closed from the south, Swedes and additional Prussian forces pressed from the northwest. Instead of fighting Napoleon piecemeal as they had in the past, they converged like the jaws of a massive trap. Whenever Napoleon reinforced one front, another surged. Whenever he tried to counterattack, he found himself surrounded by fresh troops. It was a pressure system carefully designed to exhaust him, overwhelm his lines, and leave him with nowhere to escape. As the coordinated artillery fire began, the battlefield trembled. Waves of explosive shells rained down on French positions with relentless rhythm. The sound was unlike anything soldiers had heard before: a constant thunder, rolling without pause. Villages, barns, bridges, and defensive positions exploded into flames and debris. French infantry, already shaken by exhaustion and shortages, were forced to take cover behind collapsing walls and muddy embankments. Every time they tried to move, another wave of artillery fire crashed into them. Napoleon's veterans, who had once marched through cannon fire with unshakable confidence, were now pinned, scattered, and suffocating under an iron storm. Napoleon attempted to counter the barrage. He repositioned his remaining cannons, desperately trying to create concentrated fire groups. But it was no use. His artillery had been weakened by the Russian retreat, reduced in number, and deprived of horses to move them quickly. Ammunition arrived slowly, often in incomplete loads. The muddy terrain around Leipzig trapped many guns where they stood. While the coalition artillery rotated smoothly, Napoleon's guns barked sporadically, each shot precious, each battery a fragile island surrounded by the enemy's storm. The psychological impact was devastating. French soldiers began to whisper that Europe itself was firing at them, that every nation they had conquered was returning vengeance in the form of cannon shells. Officers struggled to keep men in formation as the relentless bombardment hammered their resolve. Cavalry units, unable to maneuver, stood helpless while artillery shredded their ranks. Even Napoleon sensed that something unprecedented was happening. He rode along the lines, trying to steady the troops, but the shock was too great. He had fought massive armies before. He had faced powerful artillery before. But he had never faced a unified system of weapon made of nations acting in complete harmony. As the coalition artillery reshaped the battlefield, the synchronized infantry and cavalry attacks pushed deeper into French positions. Prussian columns attacked with renewed fury, driven by the memory of humiliation at Jena. Russian troops advanced relentlessly, disciplined and determined. Austrian forces, often underestimated, moved with new confidence, and Swedish troops, led by a former French marshal, joined the assault, turning former allies into deadly adversaries. Every attack was timed with artillery fire, every push supported by fresh reinforcements. Napoleon's ability to react to reshape the battlefield in moments was crippled by the constant pressure. And then came the breaking point, the moment where the secret weapon finally revealed its full power. As French lines buckled under the combined onslaught, Napoleon attempted one last maneuver, a counterattack meant to split the coalition's center. But before the orders could even reach his commanders, the coalition artillery shifted again, unleashing a concentrated barrage that tore through the attacking forces. The French counterattack died before it began. The shock rippled through the ranks. Napoleon had been outmaneuvered not by a single general, but by a system. For the first time in his career, he faced an enemy operating at a higher level of coordination than his own army. This was the true, secret weapon of Leipzig, not a cannon, a machine, or a chemical. It was organized intelligence, unified communication, synchronized artillery, and coordinated strategy, all functioning together with deadly efficiency. A weapon not of iron, but of unity. A weapon Napoleon could not outthink, outrun, or outfight. In that moment, the Grand Army, once the pride of Europe, began to crack, and the fall of Napoleon's empire became inevitable. Phase 1, October 16, 1813. On the morning of October 16, 1813, the fields around Leipzig awoke to a cold mist hanging low over the marshy ground. As the fog lifted, the thunder of cannon fire began slow at first, then rising into a deafening chorus that shook the earth. Napoleon, positioned near the village of Waterloo, launched a swift and aggressive counteroffensive against the approaching coalition armies. Despite his weakened forces and inexperienced recruits, the emperor's genius still flashed brightly. French infantry surged forward in tight formations, pushing back the Austrians and Russians in a series of powerful early assaults. For a moment, it seemed as though Napoleon might reclaim the initiative and turn Leipzig into another masterpiece of Napoleonic warfare. But beneath this momentary success lay a fatal truth. Napoleon had no reserves. The soldiers he placed at the front were the best he had left, and there was no second wave waiting behind them. Every step forward cost precious strength he could not replace. The coalition, meanwhile, countered with a relentless artillery barrage. Thousands of guns, more than Napoleon had ever faced, opened fire across the battlefield. The ground trembled as shells exploded through French ranks, ripping holes in battalions and shattering morale. French commanders pleaded for reinforcements, but there were none. Napoleon was forced to commit units he had planned to hold back, weakening his flexibility for the coming days. By evening, the battlefield lay covered in smoke and fire. French forces had pushed the coalition back in several areas, but at a cost to height and sustain. The coalition armies, though battered, held firm. Napoleon had landed a blow, but not a decisive one, and Europe's united armies were just beginning to gather their full strength. Phase 2, October 17th, 1813. The next day brought an eerie quiet. Fog drifted across the shattered fields as soldiers from both sides tended to their wounded, buried their dead, and repaired what little equipment they could salvage. Napoleon used the day to reorganize his lines, hoping to restore coherence to troops who had fought fiercely the day before. But the Grand Army was exhausted, many of the young recruits barely trained and terrified by the previous days. Devastation struggled to maintain discipline. Officers tried to raise morale, but the energy that once defined Napoleon's veteran armies was missing. Across the battlefield, the coalition spent the day strengthening its numerical advantage. Entire fresh corps arrived, Russian columns marching in steady rhythm, Austrian brigades moving into position, and Prussian units reinforced by recently liberated German volunteers. What had been a fragile alliance months earlier had now become a vast, unified force. With every hour, the coalition grew stronger. Their artillery parks expanded. Ammunition wagons filled the roads, and strategic positions tightened around Napoleon's army like an iron ring. Throughout the day, small skirmishes broke out along the lines. Drums echoed through the fields, muskets cracked sporadically, and cannon smoke drifted across the horizon. But no major assault came. Both sides prepared for what everyone knew was inevitable, a massive showdown that would test the fate of Europe. As night fell, French soldiers could see the glow of thousands of coalition campfires surrounding them on three sides. The message was clear. The enemy was gathering for a decisive strike. Napoleon walked among his men that night, speaking softly, encouraging them, reminding them of past victories. But deep within, he knew the truth. His army was outnumbered, undersupplied, and nearly surrounded. The battle ahead would not be one of brilliance, it would be one of survival. Phase 3, October 18th, 1813. Dawn on October 18th revealed a sight unmatched in European history. At 8 a.m., the coalition's unified artillery unleashed hell. Thousands of guns roared simultaneously, creating a single, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the sky itself. French lines disintegrated under the bombardment. Buildings collapsed, trees exploded into splinters, and entire battalions were torn apart. Before Napoleon could even reorganize his forces, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish columns advanced together in a synchronized assault. The French center held for hours, anchored by the courage of veterans who refused to yield. Napoleon launched counterattacks, shifting forces desperately from one front to another. But every time he plugged one gap, another opened. The coalition generals had coordinated their moves perfectly while Napoleon chased their attacks. They dictated the battle's rhythm. Then came the moment that broke the French line and stunned even Napoleon himself. In the early afternoon, the Saxon troops, who had fought under Napoleon for years, suddenly turned their muskets around. In a shocking betrayal, they defected mid-battle, abandoning French ranks and joining the coalition assault. As their artillery switched sides and unleashed fire on their former comrades, panic rippled through the French center. Soldiers shouted in disbelief, officers scrambled to restore order, and Napoleon watched as an entire segment of his battle line crumbled in minutes. The betrayal shattered French confidence. Coalition armies surged forward with overwhelming force, slamming into the weakened French center. Villages fell one by one. Fields turned into graveyards of shattered formations. By evening, Napoleon realized the terrifying truth. He was outnumbered, outgunned, nearly surrounded and losing ground fast. He had no choice but to retreat. Phase 4, October 19th, 1813. On October 19th, under gray skies and the smell of smoke and death, Napoleon ordered a full retreat toward the city of Leipzig. Exhausted soldiers filed through narrow streets, stumbling over rubble and bodies. Artillery wagons rumbled past, horses collapsing from exhaustion. Officers shouted commands drowned out by the thunder of distant cannon fire. The retreat became desperate. As the coalition closed in from all sides, Napoleon's plan was to withdraw across the single bridge over the White Elster River. It was his army's only escape route to buy time. Rearguard units made heroic stands, holding off waves of coalition troops. But chaos spread quickly. Tens of thousands of soldiers crowded the streets leading to the bridge. Horses screamed, wagons overturned, and units became entangled in a mass of confusion and panic. Then tragedy struck. A French engineer officer, believing the enemy was closer than it truly was, ordered the bridge blown too early. With a deafening explosion, the only escape route vanished in a cloud of smoke and fire. The bridge collapsed into the river below while over 20,000 French soldiers were still on the wrong side. The trapped men screamed for help, some jumping into the freezing water in a desperate attempt to swim across. Many drowned. Others were cut down by advancing coalition forces. Entire units were lost in minutes. Napoleon, already across the river, could only watch in horror as a massive portion of his remaining army was either captured or destroyed. By evening, the retreat was complete. What remained of the Grand Army limped westward, broken and bleeding. The Emperor, once the master of Europe, now rode silently, surrounded by the shattered remnants of an army that had once ruled the continent. He had witnessed not just defeat, but collapse. The Battle of Leipzig was over. Napoleon's empire would never recover. When the smoke finally cleared over the fields of Leipzig, Europe stared in silence at the unimaginable devastation. More than 60,000 French soldiers lay dead, wounded, or captured, the largest loss Napoleon had ever suffered in a single campaign. The once proud Grand Army, which had shaken nations and reshaped empires, was now reduced to a fraction of its strength. Horses lay dead along the river banks. Abandoned cannons sank into muddy fields. Burned villages smoldered under a gray sky. The scale of destruction was unlike anything the continent had witnessed before. It was not just a battle lost. It was an empire breaking. The coalition, exhausted but victorious, stood united on the blood-soaked ground. Russians embraced Prussians. Austrians clasped hands with Swedes, nations that had once feared Napoleon's power, now celebrated their triumph. After years of suffering, humiliation, invasion, and defeat, Europe had finally struck back. Leipzig proved what many believed impossible. Napoleon could be beaten. His aura of invincibility, built through a decade of brilliance, shattered in just 4 days of combat. The Battle of the Nations, as it came to be called, had changed everything for Napoleon. The aftermath was devastating. The retreat toward France became a long, slow journey of despair. The army carried not just physical wounds, but psychological ones. Veterans who had marched from Madrid to Moscow now trudged through German towns in silence, haunted by the memory of the bridge explosion, the Saxon betrayal, and the crushing artillery assaults. Entire divisions had vanished. Commanders had been lost. Morale, once the beating heart of the Grand Army, now flickered like a dying flame. As French forces retreated, a political earthquake rippled across Europe. German states that had once served Napoleon sensed their moment and rose in rebellion. Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, and dozens of smaller kingdoms and duchies abandoned the French alliance. Cities opened their gates to coalition forces. Prussian officers rallied the people with cries of liberation, urging them to break free from French rule. One by one, territories that had lived under the Napoleonic shadow for years reclaimed their independence. Germany was liberated, not just by armies, but by the will of its people. For the coalition leaders, the victory at Leipzig was more than military, it was symbolic. It marked the end of French dominance in Central Europe. It freed ancient kingdoms that had been forced into submission, and it proved that unity, not individual glory, could reshape the destiny of nations. The battle became a rallying point for Europe's renewed spirit, a promise that the continent could be rebuilt on new foundations, free from the fear that had dominated the early 19th century. For Napoleon, however, Leipzig was the beginning of the end. The battle destroyed not only his army, but the diplomatic and political system that held his empire together. Allies turned away. French resources dwindled. And as the winter of 1813 approached, the coalition began planning its next move with a clear objective: carry the war into France itself and end Napoleon's rule once and for all. The Battle of Leipzig would echo through history as the true turning point of the Napoleonic Wars. It was the moment when Europe united, when the old order reawakened, and when the greatest military genius of the modern age began his final descent. After Leipzig, the road no longer led to conquest. It led only to collapse. In the decades since the Battle of Leipzig, historians have returned again and again to these for days in October 1813, not just to recount the violence, but to understand the transformation of warfare itself. Modern scholars describe Leipzig as a military revolution, the moment when Europe shifted from the heroic age of individual generals to the era of coordinated, industrialized warfare. What made the coalition's victories so remarkable was not size alone, but strategy, a level of synchronized planning that had never been seen on a European battlefield. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden did not simply attack together. They communicated, maneuvered, and executed operations like parts of a single, unified machine. Historians often note that this was the birth of modern coalition strategy, where shared intelligence and coordinated logistics mattered more than one commander's brilliance. The concentration of artillery at Leipzig also represents a critical moment in military evolution. Many experts call it the world's first example of large-scale modern firepower management. Hundreds of guns deployed in rotating waves, maintaining continuous pressure and shaping the battlefield minute by minute. This concept would later influence warfare in the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and even the great battles of World War I. Leipzig demonstrated that concentrated fire, not isolated cannon crews, could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. In many ways, it was the earliest blueprint of what would become the devastating artillery doctrines of the 20th century. For Napoleon, historians often describe Leipzig as the true beginning of the end. While Waterloo is remembered as his final defeat, Leipzig was the moment where his empire began to collapse from within. His strategic weaknesses stretched supply lines, lack of cavalry, crumbling alliances, and reliance on young, inexperienced conscripts were fully exposed. More importantly, his enemies had finally learned how to counter him. At Leipzig, Europe did not defeat Napoleon with a single brilliant maneuver. Instead, it defeated him with organization, something even his genius could not overcome. Many scholars argue that Leipzig, not Waterloo, was the decisive battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Waterloo ended Napoleon's return. Leipzig ended his empire. It shattered French control in Germany, broke the loyalty of client states, destroyed the Grand Army as a functioning force, and opened the road to Paris for the coalition. Waterloo may have closed the book, but Leipzig wrote its turning point. In the end, Napoleon's empire did not fall in a single moment, nor was it destroyed by a single nation, a single general, or even a single army. It was undone by something far greater. Europe rose together. Kingdoms long divided stood side by side. Rivals became allies. Armies that had once fought each other now marched under a single purpose. The secret weapon that crushed Napoleon was not forged from iron or gunpowder, but from unity, discipline, and coordination. It was a weapon Napoleon could not outmaneuver, a strategy he could not break, a force that grew stronger with every mile he retreated. Leipzig did more than defeat an army. It ended an era. Germany was liberated, Europe was reborn, and the age of Napoleonic domination faded into history. Here, on the plains of Leipzig, the destiny of a continent was rewritten, and for the first time, the greatest conqueror of his age faced a power greater than himself, the power of nations united. This was the Battle of Leipzig.